Today, I've got Sam Anderson. He's the CEO of CarbonGraph. Sam's an engineer and a data scientist and the co-founder of CarbonGraph, which we're going to learn more about today. So Sam, welcome. And why don't we start out by, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your background and where you are, what you do, and what you're trying to achieve with CarbonGraph, and then we can dig into the nuts and bolts of tracing sustainability throughout the supply chain.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me. It's a pleasure. And CarbonGraph, we've been working for the last 2.5 years on building a next generation lifecycle assessment platform. And what lifecycle assessment means is taking a product, for example, a food product, and understanding its entire history and its entire future from an environmental impact perspective. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, if you're thinking about a plant-based burger patty, you want to understand what are the ingredients that go into it, where do they come from, where were they grown, how were they processed, how were they shipped to get to the manufacturing facility, how much energy was used at the manufacturing facility, how was that end product packaged and got to customers. Does it need to be reheated? Does that take a significant amount of energy? Even are there parts of the product, such as the packaging or food waste, that are going to end up in the landfill? Can any of that be recycled? What does the overall life cycle of that
Mm-hmm.
product look like? And what can we say about the total carbon footprint of that product throughout its life cycle? But also other things like its water footprint, its land footprint, its impact on biodiversity. And this is something that people have been doing for the last 30 plus years, primarily researchers initially, and now many different companies and private institutions around the world do these type of life cycle assessment studies, but they require pulling together massive amounts of data. And that's historically been a challenge. It's made it very expensive and time consuming to do these life cycle assessments. And so less companies have been doing them than would be great from an environmental perspective. And so what we've been developing at CarbonGraph is a new software platform to make it easier for both existing experts and people who are just entering the sustainability world to do these life cycle assessments, to do them at scale. So companies like food manufacturers who produce thousands of different individual products can actually produce life cycle assessments for all of them and keep those up to date as they work to improve them. And overall, contribute to a world where when a company or an individual buys something, it's pretty easy to actually look up what the environmental impact of that purchase is. And if we get to that point, then I think there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of forward thinking that's going on in the world right now that'll really take that information and run with it. And we get to a point where when a company makes their products more sustainable, that has real tangible value, and that'll help encourage them to continue down that journey and ultimately get us to the place where so much of us want to go over the next few decades, which is a more sustainable world and hopefully a net zero world.
Yeah, that's great. And is there, before we get into I'm super interested to learn more about the details of how you do that measurement, but was there a kind of a life event or an experience you had in your past professional world, career that made you more interested in this, or you saw an opportunity to do it better? Like, so what led you to, do this and become a co-founder of a venture like that?
Yeah, I did not start out my career in sustainability or necessarily thinking about sustainability. So I studied applied math in my undergrad, and I ended up working as an engineer in the mining sector. And so my job was to travel around the world to different mines and smelters, to take measurements of temperatures and voltages and production rates, and build models basically to help these mines produce more metal faster while remaining safe.
Right.
And that was really interesting work. I learned a ton of the underlying computer science and math and industrial engineering that we apply at CarbonGraph today. But I wasn't thinking about environmental impact. What I was doing, though, was hiking a lot, because I got a chance to travel to a lot of beautiful places, usually very remote places. I was working very long hours. And so whenever I got the opportunity to take some time off, I'd usually spend that time hiking. And that's something that I've done throughout my life.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2019, I still don't remember why. I must have been idly Googling. I came across the United Nations or IPCC report on 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees of global warming and what the impacts of that would be.
Mhm.
And it started a process of myself learning about climate change, learning about how much control our current cohort of humans, our current generations have over the future of the planet right now in the 2020s and the 2030s. And it
Mhm.
made me reflect directly on, myself working on heavy industrial projects, designing, for example, smelter equipment that would be installed in the 2020s and likely still operating in the 2050s. And my design decisions having a major impact on what the carbon footprint of those facilities would be. And those facilities having significant carbon footprint, multiple percentage points of the world's overall carbon footprint goes to mining and metal.
Mhm.
Um, I just connected the two and said, you know what, if what I care about so much, what brings me so much joy is the environment and being in it, then even setting aside all of the massive human and economic impact that climate change can have, just preserving a healthy relationship with the natural environment is something that I'd like to be able to, carry forward and have as my impact in life outside of um, supporting myself and the people who are close to me. And I think the thing that really sealed it for me is in Canada, where I'm from, engineers get an iron ring when they graduate um, from their degree program. So I have a little ring of um, stainless steel on my finger, and the idea behind that ring is it's to serve as a reminder that as an engineer, you're equipped with this scientific knowledge, but you also have an obligation to use that knowledge for the benefit of society. And what that benefit is up to you. But I think for me, that was my realization that, okay, my career challenge is going to be fighting climate change and in particular helping to reduce some of these hard to abate industrial emissions.
Mhm.
And CarbonGraph ended up being the perfect intersection of using my skills to work on that problem in the most impactful way that I could think of doing, while also having a lot of fun and getting to work on something really exciting and learning from a whole bunch of different interesting people. And, as you can hear from the background, I was in the mining sector. Now I get to work with people in food. I work with people in fashion and electronics and all these different areas that are interested in being more sustainable. And CarbonGraph is a way to help bridge that gap and share knowledge between those spaces.
Yeah, that's great. So before we get into how you gather your data and then make the calculation, when a company comes to you and they're interested in understanding the carbon footprint of their product, which in my company we do research for food companies, we don't directly interface with their carbon footprint sometimes, but we definitely get involved with consumer um, perception of sustainability, right? And certainly measuring the supply chain in any business is difficult. I think in food it has some peculiar difficulties because the supply chain is kind of primitive, right? Like there's, it's like a grown product and sometimes it's coming from very remote areas. It's difficult to do. But so when a company comes to you, are they looking to understand this for the purpose of broadcasting to their customer base? Are they looking to become more potentially like cost effective in their supply chain? Are they, what are their motivations for getting that information? Because I'm assuming, and maybe we should step back on this, that your model it's a B2B model. Like you're working for companies to do this, to measure, to do those measurements. They're a bit more like the users of your software or consultants or companies, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So the primary users of CarbonGraph are companies themselves or people who are working on sustainability programs for those companies, like consultants. We're also building out some academic partnerships and things like that because individuals and just interested people can also benefit from doing life cycle assessment. But in general, it's businesses
Mm-hmm.
and the motivations for business to make a big decision, like changing how their products are made, to be more sustainable is always multifaceted, and usually because there's multiple individuals who have different roles to play in the company. So part of our learning over the last 2 years has been figuring out how do we serve all of those interests as best as possible while not compromising on our core values, which are showing sustainability transparently. So if a company uses CarbonGraph, we want them to better understand the true impact of their products and to better understand what they need to do to make them more sustainable. The company will choose what to do with that information. So some users will keep that internal. They'll use it for planning purposes. Maybe they'll even use it just to understand where they sit relative to their competitors and understand how much risk there is of them being perceived as significantly less sustainable, for example. Some will actually publish it. So we have some users who put carbon footprint data right on, for example, their e-commerce site. We had requests to print carbon footprints on labels for food, which is really exciting. In terms of the motivation, I think it will always be a blend of sales. So ultimately, every business is primarily concerned with making its customers happy, usually selling more of its product or selling a higher quality product. And so we definitely support telling the sustainability story accurately as part of sales. When it comes to large companies, at this point, there's over 5,000 public companies who have made public commitments to be net zero by 2050. And I think initially a lot of people have been rightly skeptical about commitments like that because it's a massive undertaking and it's decades in the future. But we have seen massive action as well so far. We've taken only the first few steps in that journey, but companies truly are investing up to billions of dollars in this transition. And just the number of companies that are now committed and the number of governments and intersecting legislation that are now sort of locking the world economy into that journey is becoming more and more significant every year. So that's another component, is just you need to understand your supply chain, which is usually 80% of your carbon footprint if you want to get to net zero. And your customers need to understand the carbon footprint of your products if they want to get their supply chain to net zero.
Right.
And the motivations are, of course, different, as you mentioned, between a large company and a small company, between a company who sells directly to consumers and a company who sells to other businesses. And in the food supply chain in particular, we do see, a range of, you can have smallhold farmers in Africa, for example, who are significant contributors to the overall carbon footprint of massive European food companies. And those farmers may not even have any sort of digital device. So they're not going to be using CarbonGraph directly and entering data. On the other hand, if you go even further back in the supply chain, you might have a fertilizer supplier or a seed supplier, and they might actually be a larger and more digitally mature company. So the supply chain isn't always just a transition from, digitally mature, large, advanced operations to more primitive ones, so to speak. It can also be a transition between. And so we get to see some of those really interesting supply chain structures and try to figure out where can we most usefully invest effort to collect data so that the data we do collect tells us the most about sustainability. So we don't necessarily collect data just for the sake of having more data, but we want to dig into those areas that really contain the most new information about a product's carbon footprint, for example.
Sure. So are doing this on a mandate basis, or you're just constantly out there trying to find better sources? Like, maybe tell us a little bit about where you collect the information, and then it would be also super interesting to understand more about how you use that then to make a quantitative calculation, right?
Yeah. So we use two types of information to make a life cycle assessment. So one type is environmental impact data. And then the other type is the actual operating data from a company that tells us, what goes into their product, how much of each ingredient, where is it processed, things like that. So the second category is information that our individual users provide us when they're building life cycle assessments. For the environmental impact data, it comes primarily from third-party peer-reviewed databases like EcoInvent, for example, like Agribalize, which is a great French government food database. So we curate these different life cycle assessment databases. And that's important because we always want the work that any of our users do to be externally validated if possible.
Hmm.
It can be externally validated because they're using data that's already been confirmed to be accurate. And also by using that data, if they need to actually show their work in the future to an auditor or just to their customers and explain how they came up with their number, then the carbon footprints, for example, they're using are usually tied back to an academic paper or a third-party publication that other people can check.
Right. I would imagine that, like, let's just talk about chocolate companies, that like you can look at their supply chain, and at some level, the further back you go, all of them have a very similar look and feel to the supply chain. They're like, they're sourcing the cocoa in Ghana, and so you don't necessarily need to do that analysis for each and every individual company. You can sort of do that level of the supply chain on a probably like a per ton basis or something like that. So there's a way in which you can be economical about the effort put in. Although some companies might have really exceptionally different ways of procuring things, but then they would have to tell you that, right? They would have to like explain to you how that's different so you can calculate that differently. Otherwise, you'd be like, well, look, you're buying cocoa on the open market. We understand how that gets there, and this is therefore the footprint of that part of the journey. Is that kind of how that would work?
It's exactly
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you can just tell us the name of what you produce. You say, I produce chocolate, and we can tell you, okay, well, on average, this is the carbon footprint of chocolate.
Mhm.
And it's got pretty big error bars because there's a lot of variety in that particular industry. So you're somewhere in here.
Mhm.
And you can take that information and just share it with people right away. So here's the general information available on chocolate.
Mhm.
Or you can, what most people do is dig further into their supply chain, identify their suppliers, identify their ingredients. And if they do feel like they have a significant basically sustainability win somewhere where
Mhm.
they're saying our cocoa butter, for example, is actually produced completely differently, and we think it's worth looking into that, then they'll do more modeling. And we do, especially in food, end up sometimes with very unique products, very unique processes where it is really just one company who's pioneering something.
Mhm.
And it can be also quite interesting in cases where, because carbon footprint has been something that, even though we've been talking about it at a high level for the last few decades, most companies and most people have not been trying to measure the carbon footprint of individual products um, up until very recently, if at all.
Mhm.
And so, one of the silver linings to that is that, unlike something like the price of a commodity, there hasn't really been any market pressure to see carbon footprints all converge to a sort of equilibrium that the
Mhm.
market's willing to accept. And what that means is, if you look at different food products available on the shelf today, you might actually find two products with the same price, and one could have 25% the carbon footprint of the other. Or even
Mhm.
in the case of red meat, for example, it could be a tenth the carbon footprint of another equivalent piece of red meat. And that comes down to just differences in how they're produced. Like, what is the local environment? What is the type of native wildlife, native flora and fauna that had to be displaced to provide the space for the agriculture? These different things that necessarily haven't been thought about from an environmental lens, but actually mean that some companies are in a position where they're already winning and they might not even know it from a sustainability perspective. And for those that aren't, there are usually pre-existing process changes, sourcing changes they can make that will create a massive win. It's not like we've already optimized for carbon footprint and all of the improvements are going to be hard won. There's a lot of really low hanging fruit, so to speak.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, and then there's also then the consumer pressure, right? So we do a lot of market research and benchmark work, and more and more you see that products, even branded products, have trouble differentiating against others, right? Like at the end of the day, everyone's making a great tasting this or that, and the prices, they optimize the price to a point where going lower would make no sense because they would be margin negative. And then, of course, they're looking for other ways to differentiate themselves. And then, you see, of course, sustainability claims, but as a consumer, you don't know how to quantify that. I think the example you just used is a great one. It's like, well, would I pay 50% more for something which has a, 70% less environmental impact, right? Like, is that valuable to me? Whereas if you say like, well, the product says it's sustainable, what does that mean? Like, it's a very qualitative claim, and therefore, like, what's that really worth? And I think that you're right, is that consumers, each individual consumer may not have the ability to do this analysis, but I think overall consumers represent markets and market forces, right? And so over time, if you were to quantify comparatively all of these things across on the supermarket shelf, then I do think that you would start to see an element, at least, of the consumer population that would start to assign value to that. In which case, then you would see products and producers forced more into this as a differentiator, right? Because they're looking more and more at to how to differentiate their product, because it's hard, right? Like, once every product is the same, then the only other differentiators are, price, brand, image, of course, like, that's the whole idea behind brand, is that you create like this brand association so people pay more for something even though it's essentially the same, right? And I think this is one other really interesting evolution that's going on in the consumer space, which leads me to my next question, is like, do you see a situation where we can get a standardization across products, at least in a particular market? Like, if you look at like calories per gram, or like things that are on the label of a normal nutritional information of a product, right? You can compare one to the other. Like, there's ways to do that. There's metrics that are the same on product A and product B. Whereas what you're talking about is like, yes, these scoring systems exist, but it's more of a discretionary choice of the product producer to display that, right? Whereas if there ended up being some sort of standardization of how to quantify that, then the consumer would truly be able to make these apples for apples comparisons, and it could be regulated. Do you think that there's a way in which we can get towards a situation like that? That there would actually be a standard. There might be several different providers of this information, but there's at least a standard way of articulating it. So if you put it on your package, you have to state it in a certain way with certain units and et cetera, right?
Absolutely. And I think we're on that track. It would have seemed like a pie in the sky dream a few years ago,
Mm.
and it's still definitely a few years away, but we're on that track. So France, for example, is introducing an eco-labeling requirement for food products that would have a standard way of communicating the carbon footprint, for example, of food that needs to be on certain packages. We're seeing, so for example, when we do a life cycle assessment, we do it according to ISO standards. ISO 14044 defines how you're supposed to do a life cycle assessment. And now, if a company says the carbon footprint of our product is 10% lower than our competitors, for example, that carries a legal weight. So we've seen, for example, in the UK, the Consumer Protection Agency equivalent there has actually sued some companies for not being specific. You said your carbon footprint was lower, but did you mean the life cycle carbon footprint, including growing the ingredients and getting it to customers? Or did you just mean the carbon footprint of your operations divided by the number of products you produce? It wouldn't have been clear to, a well-meaning consumer, and depending on which it is, your claim isn't true. So they actually had to remove that. So I think from a consumer perspective, you should definitely be wary of subjective sustainability claims where, which can be as innocuous as just labeling something with green color, or, adding eco or adding sustainable into the name. But you can know that if a company is actually making an objective claim, mentioning carbon footprint, putting a number on something, there may not be laws in place right now that govern exactly how they do that calculation, but there is a framework developing to hold them to account. And so it's definitely a good thing for companies to be putting that data out there. And they're going to get it wrong a few times as well. So there needs to be a bit of grace, where they weren't publishing any of this information in the past. Now they're starting to publish it. But that will enable us moving to a regulated system. And I think we'll also see different parts of the market play roles. So retailers, for example, can impose labeling requirements, perhaps not initially in their store, the packaging has to be different, but on their online platform. they can make sure that sustainability data is available for every product on the online platform.
Mhm.
Even we've had some conversations with food distributors who sit between individual food producers and retailers, and they've been looking at, could we offer a product level carbon footprint report with every product that we distribute and make that a kind of a core offering. So if a brand works with us, they know we're going to help them get that report. If a retailer buys from us, they're going to know they're always going to have access to a report like that. And I think that type of work will lead us up to a point where regulators feel comfortable implementing a common labeling system without seeing it as an undue hardship on companies, which is probably one of the main blockers right now.
Right. Okay, so that leads me to my next question. What do you think is the better pathway? Maybe it's both. Is it that a regulator would step in? And I agree with you, regulators would probably have to say this is the standard of articulating this information. But should a regulator step in and say all products have to have it? Or is it better to have the consumers say, well, I want to see the products that I buy having it. And so if it doesn't, I'm not going to buy it. And therefore, that just causes probably a more consequential feedback loop, which is the actual brand being like, okay, I've got to put this on my product. And okay, if I'm going to do that, I have to do it in this way, rather than the government saying all products have to have it, right? What's your opinion, maybe based on what you've seen work or not work, or because every time, at least I'm American, and every time Americans feel like the government is telling them what they have to do in life, they don't do it. But every time they feel like their brand awareness or their commercial desire guides them towards doing something, they do it, 10 times faster than the government tells them. So there are different levers in different places that will work, and regulation is one way, but just like market forces is another, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously a big question, and I think both will have to play a role. There'll need to be some regulation to make sure that people aren't abusing that consumer preference and putting out false information, basically.
Mm.
I think in many ways it is an element of a free market that you should just have the environmental impact of something you're buying available to you, and you can make a decision for yourself what you're going to do with that information,
Mm.
um, for both businesses and individuals. So I think there's a compatibility between environmental transparency and, in some ways, less regulation or less control over what we're buying, because if that information is available, then we can make the decisions for ourselves. It's sort of like right now you can understand the nutritional impact more or less of food when you look at the package. Um, if you were responsible for doing that on your own, like, prior to the introduction of nutrition labels, which was only in the latter half of the 20th century, um, then you'd be relying on how the company wants to pitch that nutrition value to you, or maybe how your friends are telling you about what's more nutritious. And there's good and bad to that, but I think most people are happy to know that they can look up the nutrition labels now, and they don't consider that government overreach. So it'll be a transition for sure,
Mhm.
and there'll be some ways to overstep there, but I think it'll be really valuable overall, and it'll also enable a system where environmental impacts aren't something that we interpret in a binary way. So, products shouldn't really be looked at as either this is a sustainable product or this is an unsustainable product. Every
Mhm.
company, every person buying a food product should be able to make those balances, just like we make balances in our diet. Like, not everything we eat is binarily healthy versus not healthy. And
Mhm.
then that'll enable dealing with these environmental issues in a more incremental, more equilibrium way. So there's some economic value to being more sustainable, to lowering carbon footprint. It's got a certain value today. Maybe it's going to have triple that value in 2035. And businesses can take note of that, and they can begin confidently moving their supply chains and their product designs towards that, without thinking about it in terms of fickle changes in consumer preference or um, immediate and abrupt regulatory changes.
Right. That's probably sensible. Okay, so let's imagine a world where this is actually measured, it's available, that information is there. And then you go to the shelf and you see as a consumer that well, like the products, because many of these products, at least in food, are all coming from the major brands, right? Like, I mean, the ones that have the distribution and the supply chain power are the major brand companies, right? At least in the Western world, you know, in the US and Western Europe and Canada. Um, and then you see like, well, all of them more or less kind of have this similar carbon footprint data. And so you have this concept of potential mean reversion, right? Because the consumer has no idea what is the potential of carbon footprint reduction in a supply chain because they're just looking at a score. And does that mean that they should accept the score that their brand is giving them? Obviously you would hope that the brands would get into this kind of competitive thing of trying to get better than the other because they see that as a real value add to the consumer and they can gain more market share. But what typically happens in a lot of these scenarios like this in markets is that you get like an equilibrium and they kind of tacitly collude to like basically keep it the way that it is because it would be expensive for any of them to change it, right? So what do you think about that? Like, you know, I would imagine that there are ways in which even you, maybe from your position in doing these assessments, you're starting to see like opportunities for creating more sustainable supply chains. Like, hey, look, like this part of the supply chain is really inefficient, and like a technology change here, or this change here, or that change here would really impact it. But the average person on the street has no idea that that exists, right? And of course, anybody who's not in the position to do that research would also not know it. So maybe it takes an entrepreneur to come along and try to fix that, or otherwise like these brands can kind of just bury it and just like hope that life continues the way that it is. So you know, measurement is one thing. I think pressure is another thing, but then you have to think about this kind of like tacit collusion amongst competitors because they don't really want to change exactly what they're doing because it will cost them money and they're afraid, right? So
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. It's going to be a complex challenge, and there really is going to be a step change between not having the measurements and having the measurements, simply because like how do you decide how to manage something if you don't even know whether it's in a good or a bad
yeah,
state, right?
totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah.
But once you have the numbers,
Yeah.
absolutely, there's going to be all sorts of pitfalls and dead ends. For one thing, I don't think most brands, unless they're required to, will be putting carbon footprint numbers in the form of, this meatless patty has 95 grams of CO2 equivalent carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that information might be shared primarily for the purpose of showing we did the math, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that number is there to give you the confidence that we looked at this, but it'll be the responsibility of other systems to help take that data and communicate to consumers what it means. So, and then that'll depend on the like political leaning in some sense of the market. So you have, for example, Ecuador and other countries today, when it comes to nutrition, use a red light, yellow light, green light system, where
Mm-hmm.
you just see right on it, salt, it's a yellow, sugar, it's a red,
Mm-hmm.
and you can just decide for yourself. You can do some research and decide, am I a normally yellow, sometimes red, sometimes green consumer? Am I a only green consumer? You can kind of make it easier that way. You can also have companies obviously can use the data to make marketing that is compelling,
Mm-hmm.
but because they're using this quantified information and it's publicly available, they can be held to account. So I think what we can suspect is that um, companies will be using all of their great sales and marketing skills that they currently deploy, but they'll need to do it in the same way that a company can't essentially just lie and say, oh, our products are cheaper, but in fact they're more expensive. Well, everybody would figure that out pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If they're required to report the carbon footprint of their products, then it kind of gives us that factual baseline for all of the marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in terms of, where will individual companies sit? Will they collude to be at the same level? I think for one thing, the fact that they're probably not at the same levels right now is an important point. So there will be some natural brands who are ahead
Mm-hmm.
because of the decisions they've made in the past. And then there's also going to be direct operational costs to having a higher environmental impact, at least in some geographies. So the EU is the most advanced in terms of carbon pricing,
Hmm.
and they have significant carbon pricing systems within the EU. They've now begun introducing the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which means when you import something into Europe in a pretty broad class of commodities, you need to report its carbon footprint. And in the future, they're going to start charging their tariffs based on that carbon footprint. So if it's higher, you pay more money. If it's lower, you pay less money.
Hmm.
And when that starts to take effect, even governments who haven't been proposing similar systems will actually potentially need to impose similar systems to balance out their own markets with,
Hmm.
either to protect or to promote their products. And so we'll end up with a system where people are now paying for their carbon footprint,
Hmm.
and so they're certainly tracking it, and it'll mean an actual price increase or a profit decrease if you have a higher carbon footprint. And so then there's that additional pressure in the mix that I think will, and then not to mention, at least currently, most of these large food brands have said they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And people will be holding them to account, hopefully. And between those pressures, I hope we won't stagnate on the numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're basically penalizing the company, and then the company is deciding to pass that on to the to the customer. I mean, the customer can also penalize themselves and like hold themselves to account, in which case they're probably at this point paying a higher premium. But of course, you don't really know where that premium is coming from. It just might be that the brand decides to charge more for something that's sustainable. It may not even cost them more, right? So I think that there's got to be a lot more transparency there if brands are serious about doing this. And it's a tough thing to quantify, as you say, right? So
It's like quality, right?
what's that? Go ahead.
Like, like we often talk about, what are what are consumers willing to pay for? Oh, people, would you pay 15% more if you knew that the water footprint of this product was lower? And the sort of common wisdom is that no, people won't do that. They only care about getting a high quality product at the right price. But
Mhm.
what does quality mean? Because, we all have very peculiar and individual preferences when it comes to the food we buy, for example, and what we consider to be good. And
Mhm.
that doesn't just include the taste, it includes our perception of the brand. And I think sustainability, and in particular, quantified objective sustainability, like having a low carbon footprint, having a low water footprint, is going to start to become closer and closer to the core of what it means to be a good brand.
Mhm.
And that'll be a kind of an interesting transition where it's not like a secondary metric or like an additional thing on top of nutrition and quality and price that we're asking people to think about. They'll kind of meld into that subjective perception of quality.
Mhm.
And then at that point, of course, you want your product to be higher quality. Of course, you want your product to be perceived with higher esteem by consumers. So
Yeah.
that transition is going to be an interesting one. And McKinsey did a study earlier this year showing that products that have sustainability claims on the packaging do sell better.
Mhm.
Um, so that doesn't necessarily mean sustainable products sell better because some sustainability claims aren't factual. But because we have all of these laws and this literacy developing around interpreting these sustainability claims, you
Mhm.
can expect that untrue sustainability claims are going to become hopefully less and less common. And so that will truly be a correlation between products that are more sustainable do sell better.
Yeah. I think that particularly in consumer goods, and I'm not as familiar with fashion and these others, but definitely in food, it's a very generational transition because people get comfortable with eating and eating in a way that they also are used to from their childhood or middle age. I mean, yes, people do change the way they consume, but it's nowhere near the change that you see between generations, right? Just because,
Yeah.
children are, I think, imprinted with a lot of these early habits of how they think about products and consumption and taste and pleasure around something you do every day, which is, eat. Um, so yeah, I think that if you just look at the overall cycle of just modern advertising, which essentially started in like like really in earnest in the 1950s after the war, you created a lot better quality products over the course of 6 or 7 decades, right? Like the quality of products is far greater than it was like in the 80s, right? Like it's amazing, right? Like how much better stuff is and like at a similar price point. And so I think probably then you will bake in these other what we call purchase drivers as important factors, and sustainability is definitely one of them, right? Whereas it used to just be driven by like price and availability, and of course then like quality, which in food was usually equating to taste. But you even look at the other things like nutritional content, right? Like the fact that like so much of processed food, and people are getting, I think, a little bit more aware of this. One of the things that processing food does is it it removes nutrients, right? And nutrients is what's necessary to make your body feel satiated, right? It makes you stop eating, right? So one of the problems around the obesity issue is that when you eat a lot of processed food, you want to eat more of it naturally. Like it's not that you have a problem, it's
Mm.
just like your body is basically telling you it's not yet fully fueled, because the natural nutrients that it would expect an organism of nature are not coming, right? And then therefore you eat more calories per unit of nutrition, right? And that's one of the big problems behind processed food, actually. And some of these new diet pills actually are counteracting that. That's what they do. They kind of like make you trick your body into thinking that it's got the kind of like nutritional component and fullness that it needs. And so, yeah, I don't agree with
Interesting.
that. Yeah, I don't agree with that approach. But I mean, I think sustainability is part and parcel. Also, probably correlates. Maybe you have a comment on this, with process nature. Like anytime you process something, you're putting you're putting energy into it, right? In a food product. It's got to move from one place to another. It's got to go through some process, like it's got to move around, or it's got something that's going on in a manufacturing context that takes energy. So I would imagine that like nutrition correlates in some, maybe not one to one, but negatively to sustainability as well. Even though, as you say, like probably the footprint is mostly related to transport of the product. I would bet, like in the
Mm.
like how far you have to transport it. But processing definitely reduces nutritional content, and it probably increases carbon footprint because it takes energy to process something. Yeah.
It's very multifaceted because you you have the problem of food waste. So
Mhm.
about a third of food is wasted. And so you can think of that, all of the energy, all of the emissions it took to produce that food was essentially for nothing. And to a certain extent, preservatives or food that has a longer shelf life can help alleviate that, but it's only a part of the food waste problem. And I think it's of secondary importance to delivering healthy food. One of the things people don't realize when it comes to food in general is that the single most important component to its sustainability is how are the ingredients produced.
Mhm.
So, what type of crop does it take if it's a plant-based food? Well, really, all foods are plant-based in some sense, because if it's meat, that those animals eat plants.
Mhm.
And what type of plants do you have to grow? How much plants do you have to grow? What type of land do you have to clear? So one of the reasons why beef is basically the coal of food when it comes to carbon footprint is because the cow just needs to eat so much.
Mhm.
And if you're looking at, in particular, beef from beef from the Amazon, um, to produce all of that land for the cattle to eat, both
Mhm.
to grow, feed, and for grazing, you need to cut down rainforest, which is a very high density of carbon stored in it, not to mention all of the biodiversity.
Mhm.
And then when you look at beef in the US, for example, it's the same, it's not the same cattle, but it's a cow still. But it's grazing on land that, generally speaking, had grasses on it before, much less biomass, much less carbon stored there.
Mhm.
And so there's actually a significantly lower carbon footprint of US cattle compared to, say, Brazilian cattle.
Mhm.
But these impacts, even if we're talking about plants, rice, oats, whatever, are generally more important than the transportation. So transportation matters, but it's of secondary importance to the baseline sustainability of what is the product and what are its ingredients from. So if you're eating a plant-based diet where most of that food is coming from overseas, it's going to be more sustainable than eating a local meat diet, at least from a carbon footprint perspective. But of course, there's other elements to deciding, what your relationship with your local economy is and all of that. And with respect to processing, I'm not sure on that one. But you're certainly right that anything that takes energy contributes to the carbon footprint. And probably the way I think about it though is the food waste component of it is probably the most important one, because if you're just eating more or wasting more, then that's going to be the biggest driver.
That's interesting. Um, as an individual person, I think about this in a way that is more related to the fact that I can make decisions about what I eat and what I don't eat, and I can eat something that's very local, right? It would be great if also for the people that end up listening to this, that we could recommend some other sources of reading or knowledge to kind of like unpack some of the things and factual elements that you've been talking about. Do you think it would be possible to recommend some reading, and then we'll include that for the viewers to take a look at, to just understand a little bit more of what's going on in the supply chain? I'm struck by some of my assumptions just a few minutes ago that were seemingly not correct about some of these impacts. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll recommend two things. So one is an academic paper, but don't get scared by that. It's actually a very easy read. It's got a lot of beautiful figures, beautiful colors in it. It's a paper called Poor and Nemeczek from
Okay.
2018. POORE 2018 food. If you Google that, you'll find it. You can
Yeah,
find it for
we'll
free.
definitely put links on it for the viewers. So yeah, and then yeah.
And so that paper, what it really did was it started to break down across all the different categories of food we consume, what all the different environmental impacts are, and showing them in a really clear way.
Hmm.
And then Our World in Data is a website that, for a whole variety of topics, presents data in a simple and beautiful way to consume, but they have a lot of information focused around food systems that break down this
Hmm.
information. So it start there from just a pure environmental information perspective, and then sort of weave that into all the other information that you use, to make your dietary decisions.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks very much. I think we could probably go on for a while, but unfortunately, we're out of time. But I definitely wish you all the best with CarbonGraph. It sounds like you're fulfilling a space that is in need and in growing need and focus. So that's great to hear, and we'll definitely take a look and continue to see great things coming from you all there.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
Great, thank you.